And here's was the federal government stepping in to help people. It may not have been enough. In some cases, it didn't help, but somebody was trying. And one had that feeling that maybe it was going to work.
Millions of Americans had been helped in the first year of the New Deal. But for millions more, the year 1933 ended in frustration. President Roosevelt had lifted their spirits, but not their circumstances.
After a time, the haunting thought could not be put down that maybe this Great Depression was never going to end. But with the sense of rising expectations, people are stirred out of their lethargy, and in 1934, there is the most radical mood of any year of the Great Depression.
President Roosevelt had contributed to that radical mood when he became the first American president to say that labor had a right to unionize. But businessmen remained defiantly anti-union. In the spring of 1934, emboldened dock workers closed ports all along the Pacific coast. In San Francisco, their strike turned violent.
We heard on the radio that all this terrible stuff was going on the waterfront. And my husband was down there. And I remember my mother and I were frightened and very upset. Would Harold make it?
It got so bad that 2 men were killed. They were killed by bullets, ostensibly from the police. Nobody really ever figured that one out totally.
Harold was right on the corner where one was killed. Shocked the city. Killings then used to shock people.
The funeral for the 2 murdered strikers drew 50,000 people.
That funeral was so... It so shocked the city. It was so impressive.
That was enough to infuriate the people of San Francisco. So much, they said, we've had it. Every day we'll watch these longshoremen and seamen getting beaten and clubbed. We've had it up to our eyebrows. By God, whatever it takes to win a strike, we're going to win it. And they stopped. All work. Even a barber says, we refuse to give a haircut to anybody until the strike is over. We sympathize with the union. We sympathize with the men. And so they shut the port down, shut the city down.
Little stores closed until our boys win.
The city was quiet as hell. Nothing moved for 4 solid days.
The longshoremen won virtually all their demands, encouraging workers across the country to move against management. In 1934, there were more than 1,800 strikes for union recognition.
Coal miners, steel workers, warehouse, different people packing out. They said if a bunch of starving seamen and longshoremen could weather the storm, then we could do it back in Pittsburgh, or we could do it here, we could do it there.
Labor unrest was only one of Roosevelt's problems in 1934. Economic recovery had stalled, and critics complained that he'd gone too far. The constitutionality of some New Deal programs were being challenged in the courts, and business leaders were warning that FDR had steered the country recklessly to the left. But Roosevelt knew that his program still hadn't reached millions of desperate Americans, and he didn't know how long they would wait. Discontent and frustration gave rise to any number of demagogues, including the charismatic radio priest Father Charles Coughlin,
Shelterless children and shelterless men and women.
Dr. Francis Townsend, self-proclaimed advocate for the elderly, radical spellbinders who claimed the New Deal was dying. During 1934, one of these would-be saviors developed a national following and presidential ambitions.
Because Hoover wanted to plow up every
He was called the Kingfish. Senator and former Louisiana Governor Huey Long.
After we told you people that Hoover was a numbskull.
The best entertainment you had was when Huey came to town to speak.
They put it in to plow up every third row of cotton.
Everybody went to hear him, whether they were for him or against him. He was marvelous.
The Lord has answered the prayer. He has called the barbecue.
He used such expressive language.
He said to
You just had to listen.
155 million Americans.
And when people listened, many discovered they liked what they heard.
What Huey Long was saying was that he was going to soak the rich and he was going to give that money to the poor. His plan was never really carefully worked out, and in his own state in Louisiana, he fell notably short of redistributing the wealth. But it had a kind of direct appeal that the more complex programs of the New Deal lacked, and also provided a focus for the animus against the rich that had been building during the years of the Great Depression.
Long promised every American a house, a car, a radio. In return, he wanted power. Absolute power.
You couldn't do anything in Louisiana unless you got his okay. He was vicious. And if you told him no, he'd knock you down.
He had built up a private police force. He had shown his contempt for the democratic processes, and that created a great deal of worry in Washington.
Not just Southerners, but Midwestern farmers and New York factory workers were joining Long Share Our Wealth clubs.
I advised our Roosevelt.
By 1935, Franklin Roosevelt was privately calling Huey Long the most dangerous man in America.
They set up and called General Hugh S. Johnson down here to take charge of that.
When you have food riots, you have the makings of a dictatorship. Don't think you wouldn't do it too. You might vote the wrong way. He rose on the votes of the people, and Huey Long was rising on the votes of the people too.
Huey Long never got the chance to run for president. He was cut down by an assassin in September 1935. By then, President Roosevelt was hard at work on a populist agenda of his own, pushing Congress to create the Social Security programs, welfare for the poor, and jobs for 8 million people on public projects of every description. This was called the Second 100 Days, and it reshaped American life.
The legislation of the second 100 days gives an underpinning to the economy that's not been there before. There's now a system of unemployment compensation, of old age pensions. The United States, for the first time, has a centralized banking system. And by 1936, there are visible signs of recovery.
6 years after he lost his grocery store, Miriam Johnson's father found a steady job with the Works Progress Administration.
He was so happy to get up in the morning. My father was so happy, even though the work, by this time he wasn't a kid, and it was pick and shovel work, you know. But he was so happy to have something to do and to get paid for it. To me, the Roosevelt era revolutionized the perception of what government owes the people and what its role is.
We are fighting to save a great and precious form of government.
The programs that he put in were imperative for that period. And I think it was a godsend that we had him, and we maintained the democracy that we had all cherished.
Campaigning for a second term in 1936, Roosevelt told a cheering crowd, "You look happier today than you did 4 years ago." And they were. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was re-elected by the greatest margin in the history of American politics. In the 4 years since President Roosevelt had taken office, America had experienced a revolution, and it had been led by the president himself. The New Deal programs of the Depression era transformed the country's landscape. One project alone, the Tennessee Valley Authority, built dams, brought electricity, ended floods, and lifted families out of poverty in 7 states. But as he took office for his second term in January 1937, Roosevelt's New Deal still had not completely overcome the Depression in America. By 1937, the Depression in Germany was over. Adolf Hitler had kept his promise to give the people work.
Unemployed people disappeared practically overnight. There were no young, healthy men standing at the corners of Berlin and begging around for pennies. People had jobs, were happy.
The secret of Germany's new prosperity was rearmament. There were plenty of jobs making powerful new weapons and building a highway system as much for tanks as for cars.
It was also a kind of New Deal, but he was preparing for war.
The first step came in March of 1936 when German troops marched unopposed into the Rhineland to reoccupy territory lost to France after the First World War.
He was leading us to the place of the sun. And I sincerely and honestly believed in all that. And when I came home and told my father, arguments started, and my mother often said, "No, Fritz, leave that boy alone. He can't help it that he is so brainwashed." And then I started again with my mother. "What do you mean by brainwashed?" And now, of course, I realize my parents were right, but it's all too late.
Now Adolf Hitler would try to keep another promise to the German people: to build a new German empire. One, he said, that would last 1,000 years. Depression and desperation had unleashed a force that would alter the course of the 20th century. We'll see that on the next episode of The Century, America's Time. I'm Peter Jennings. Thank you for joining us.